"It's he," the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of pure recognition. The silence that followed was deafening. Lawyers stopped mid-sentence. The clerk stopped typing. Even the bailiff shifted nervously. My daughter Jennifer rolled her eyes and whispered something to his wife, David, which made them both chuckle quietly. They had no idea what those two words meant, but I did. At 68 years old, I had lived long enough to recognize when fate was about to turn the tables. My name is Matthew, and when I walked into that courtroom that Tuesday morning in Denver, my own family believed I would lose everything. They thought he was just a stubborn widower clinging to an old house, who had lost the ability to make rational decisions. What they never realized was that I carried a history far older and far more powerful than his greed. 3 weeks earlier, David had arrived at my house with a briefcase full of documents and that fake smile I had learned to hate. "Matthew, we need to talk about his future," he said, as if it were a favor. Jennifer stood beside him, wearing the green coat I had bought her for Christmas, but his eyes were as cold as winter ice. "Dad, the house is too big for you. David has found the perfect retirement community for her." They weren't asking. They were informing me. For 42 years, I had built my life in that house with my late wife, Rebecca. Every brick carried our memories. Every room echoed with Jennifer's childhood laughter. But to him, it was just property, numbers, and potential profit. David opened the folder with calculated movements. "We've already started the paperwork. The community has a waiting list, but I managed to get his name at the front of the line. You should be thankful." Thankful? The word hung in the air like an insult. "This is my home," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "I'm not going anywhere." David's smile faded. "Matthew, be reasonable. You're getting older. Last month, he tripped in the garden. What if something happens when no one is around?" I wanted to remind him that he had only slipped on the wet grass, recovering on his own. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They had already decided his fate without him. Over the next few days, David brought in appraisers who walked through her house as if it were already for sale. They measured rooms with quick, disinterested movements, scribbling notes on their clipboards. "The plumbing is outdated," said one of them coldly. "Her kitchen floor is old-fashioned. It would need a complete renovation." I stood silently in the corner, clutching the edge of my apron. Those floors he so casually dismissed had been laid brick by Rebecca's hands when Jennifer was 10. As they continued her cold inspection, turning my home into numbers on a spreadsheet, I felt something stir inside me. A determination I hadn't felt since Rebecca left. They thought I was helpless, that I had lost the ability to fight. But while David smiled confidently, explaining to the appraisers about resale value optimization, I was already mentally organizing information they were completely unaware of. What my family never knew was that Rebecca had kept secrets. Secrets that he would discover just days before that court hearing. Secrets that would change everything forever. If you're enjoying this family twist story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how an underestimated man would turn the greatest humiliation of his life into the sweetest victory he had ever witnessed. Because when Jennifer and he saw the judge recognize me that morning, they finally understood that they had completely underestimated who he really was. David arrived 3 days later with a team of lawyers, turning my living room into a temporary office. He had traded his casual suit for something more expensive, more intimidating, as if clothing could validate her authority over her life. "Matthew, I've brought in some experts to better explain her situation," he announced, gesturing to 2 middle-aged men carrying black leather briefcases. Jennifer stood beside him, but something had changed in her demeanor. Her shoulders were tense, and she avoided her direct gaze. The daughter who used to run into his arms as a child now seemed like a stranger in her own home. "I don't need experts to understand my own life," I replied calmly, remaining seated in Rebecca's armchair. The taller lawyer, who introduced himself as Harrison Mitchell, opened his briefcase with theatrical movements. "Mr. Patterson, we have reviewed her financial situation. The expenses of maintaining this property significantly exceed her retirement income." They had investigated her finances without permission. The violation of this intimacy burned in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "In addition," Mitchell continued, "we have identified several safety incidents in recent months. Falls, forgetfulness, behaviors that suggest cognitive decline." David smiled with false satisfaction. "We're concerned about you, Matthew. This isn't just a financial issue, It's a health and safety issue. What incidents? I asked, my voice remaining calm despite my rising anger. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice small and rehearsed. Dad, you forgot to turn off the stove last week. And you fell in the garden. The stove stayed on for 10 extra minutes while I was answering the phone, I corrected. And I tripped over a hose you left in the way, Jennifer. I didn't fall or hurt myself. David leaned forward, his tone becoming more aggressive. Matthew, you're in denial. These are clear signs that you need specialized care. The second, younger lawyer slid a set of documents across the table. These are power of attorney and asset transfer forms. With her signature, Jennifer will be able to make medical and financial decisions on his behalf, ensuring he receives proper care. I examined the papers, immediately recognizing the legal trap they represented. Once signed, I would completely lose control over his life, his assets, his autonomy. What if I refused to sign? The silence that followed was laden with unspoken menace. David and Mitchell exchanged a glance that confirmed his worst fears. Well, Mitchell said slowly, in that case, we would need to consider a formal psychiatric evaluation to determine her capacity to make rational decisions. The threat was clear: sign willingly, or we will be forced to declare her mentally incompetent. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimpse of the girl I had raised. But David put his hand on her shoulder, and whatever hesitation she might have felt disappeared. It's for your own good, Dad, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. David began showing up unannounced, always accompanied by different experts, a geriatrician who had never examined me, an accountant who questioned every penny of my retirement, even a psychologist who watched his movements as if he were a specimen in a laboratory. They turned my home into a stage where I was simultaneously the lead actor and the defendant. Every gesture of mine was analyzed, every word weighed as evidence of my supposed incompetence. The most painful moment came when I found her alone in the kitchen, where Rebecca used to bake her famous apple pies. Jennifer, I began softly, do you really believe I need to be committed against my will? She couldn't look her in the eye. He says it's the right thing to do. He understands these legal issues better than we do. He hasn't known me for 42 years, I replied. He wasn't there when you had pneumonia at age 7, and she spent 3 nights awake taking care of you. He didn't see her mother and her building this house brick by brick, planting every tree in the yard. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Things are different now, Dad. You're getting older, and David wants to make sure you're taken care of. David wants to make sure he has control over this property, I corrected, my patience finally wearing thin. And you're allowing he to use you as his tool. Jennifer pulled away from me, her expression hardening again. David takes care of her in a way you never did. He's given me stability, financial security. The accusation cut deep. Stability and financial security, things I had sacrificed so much to provide for her, but which David now claimed as her own achievements. That night, alone in my bed, I allowed the tears to finally fall. Not for the house they threatened to take, nor for the money they thought I didn't have. I cried for the daughter I had lost to a man who saw her only as a means to his selfish ends. But it was during that darkest night that I remembered the words Rebecca had whispered in her final days. Matthew, if anything happens to me, look for the blue box in the attic. There are things in there you need to know. At the time, I thought she was delirious from the medication. But now, facing the possibility of losing everything, her words echoed with new urgency. As David and Jennifer planned my forced removal, I began to realize that Rebecca had left more than just memories in our home. She had left tools for a battle I didn't even know I would need to fight. What they didn't know was that the smartest woman I ever knew had spent her last months preparing to protect the man she loved, even after his death. The next morning, David arrived earlier than usual, bringing with him a man in sunglasses who introduced himself as Dr. Peterson, a geriatric assessment specialist. His presence in my home at 7:30 a.m., without prior notice, was a deliberate violation of my privacy. Matthew, we've decided to expedite the process, David announced, settling himself in my living room as if he owned the place. Dr. Peterson will conduct a quick assessment today. Jennifer stood behind him, avoiding my gaze, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Some part of her still knew this was wrong. I haven't authorized any assessment, I replied firmly. And I won't participate in one. Dr. Peterson opened a folder and began scribbling notes, observing his movements as if I were an interesting specimen. Mr. Patterson, resistance to medical care is often a symptom of cognitive decline. The trap was closing in on me with frightening speed. Every word I said in my defense would be interpreted as evidence of his incompetence. Jennifer, I called softly, ignoring the other two men. Are you really going to allow this? Are you going to let strangers decide his own father's future? She finally looked at him, and for a moment I saw tears welling up. But David put his hand on her shoulder, a seemingly affectionate gesture that was actually a show of control. Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be, she said, her voice sounding rehearsed. We're trying to take care of you. Dr. Peterson continued his notes, documenting our conversation as if it were a therapy session. I realized that every word was being used against him, building a case for his alleged mental incapacity. I need a moment alone, I said, rising from the armchair. I'll make coffee for everyone. David smiled with satisfaction. Sure, Matthew. But let Jennifer help you. For her safety. In the kitchen, as Jennifer nervously arranged cups, I tried one last approach. Jennifer, her mother died in this house, holding my hand. You were born in the upstairs bedroom during a snowstorm because we couldn't get to the hospital in time. This house is our history, our family. Tears finally fell down her face. I know, Dad. But David says we can't let emotions get in the way of practical decisions. David says, I repeated bitterly. When did David's words become more important than her own conscience? She didn't answer, but I could see the internal struggle in her eyes. There was still a spark of the girl he had raised, buried under years of psychological manipulation. When we returned to the living room, Dr. Peterson had finished his initial observations. He closed his folder with a theatrical flourish. Based on what I've observed, resistance to care, defensive behavior, irrational attachment to property, I recommend a full evaluation in a hospital setting, he announced, as if pronouncing a sentence. The room spun around me. In less than an hour, they had created a false medical case that could result in my involuntary hospitalization. No, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I'm not going to any hospital. David leaned forward, his predatory smile more visible now. Matthew, you don't understand. It's no longer a choice hers. It was at that moment that the memory of Rebecca's words crystallized completely. Look for the blue box in the attic. There are things in there you need to know. For 42 years, Rebecca had been my partner in everything. She knew people I didn't know, kept secrets she guarded carefully. If she had left something hidden, it was because she knew I would need it someday. All right, I said calmly, taking everyone by surprise. But I need to pack some personal belongings before I leave. Things that belonged to Rebecca. Dr. Peterson glanced at his watch. 15 minutes, Mr. Patterson. We don't want to delay the process. I climbed the stairs with legs that felt like they were made of lead, but when I reached the second-floor hallway, my determination crystallized. It was no longer about the house or money. It was about dignity, about a man's right to decide his own fate. The attic was a space I had avoided since Rebecca's death. Too dusty, too many memories. But now, rummaging through old boxes and covered furniture, I searched for something blue. I found it behind an old wardrobe, a small navy blue metal box that was new to me. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, typical of Rebecca's meticulousness. Inside, my reality was completely reconfigured. Financial documents showed bank accounts I didn't know about. Stock certificates from companies Rebecca had secretly invested in. Deeds to properties in other states. But the most shocking thing was a letter dated just 2 months before her death. My dear Matthew, it began in her familiar handwriting. If you are reading this, then someone is trying to take advantage of your kindness. I kept these resources not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew his generous heart. You would give anything to help anyone who asked. My breathing became shallow as I continued reading. The property where Jennifer and David live has belonged to us for 5 years. I bought it through an investment company when the building was in financial trouble. They pay rent to a management company, but the money comes directly into her account. I also own shares in the company where David worked before he was fired for financial irregularities. The world spun around me. Rebecca had not only left me resources, She had left me power over the very people who were now trying to control me. The letter continued, "Use this information wisely, my love. Not to hurt, but to protect the dignity we have worked so hard to build. And remember, Jennifer is her daughter. She may be lost now, but she can still be saved." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket along with the most important documents. When I came downstairs, I was no longer the same man who had gone up. Dr. Peterson was checking his watch impatiently. "Mr. Patterson, we need to go now." "Actually," I replied, my voice calm but laden with a new authority, "I've changed my mind." David stood up abruptly. "Matthew, we explained that this is no longer her choice." "Perhaps we should reconsider," I said, removing one of the documents from my pocket. "Especially considering that I have here the deed to the building where you live." The silence that followed was absolute. David turned pale, Jennifer's mouth fell open in shock, and Dr. Peterson suddenly looked uncomfortable. "That's impossible," David stammered. "We've been paying rent for years." "To a management company that transfers the payments directly to me," I replied calmly. My late wife was much more astute than anyone realized. Jennifer sat heavily in her chair, the impact of the revelation hitting her hard. "Dad, does that mean?" "It means you've been living on my property while planning to take me off mine," I added. "And it also means, Dr. Peterson, that his services are no longer required." The doctor was already hurriedly putting away his papers. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding. I will let the family resolve these matters privately." After he left, David made one last attempt. "Matthew, even if that's true, we're still concerned about her ability to manage these assets." I smiled for the first time in weeks, a smile that carried 42 years of experience and the wisdom left behind by the most intelligent woman I ever knew. "David," I said calmly, "I suggest he start looking for a new place to live. You have 30 days. The look of utter shock on his face was just the beginning. Rebecca had left him much more than money or property. She had left him the tool to regain his dignity. And the real battle was just beginning. David didn't leave quietly. The next morning I found my garden vandalized, flowers trampled, the hose cut to pieces, and a message scrawled in red paint on my front door, "You will pay for this." My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had witnessed everything through his kitchen window. "Matthew, he was here at 5 in the morning," she said nervously, handing me photos she had taken on her cell phone. He looked like a man possessed. The images showed David, clearly recognizable, systematically destroying the garden that Rebecca and I had cultivated for decades. More importantly, they showed her license plate and the exact time of the vandalism. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, carefully putting the photos away. "These could be very useful." As I cleaned up the debris in the garden, my phone rang. It was Jennifer, his voice shaky and desperate. "Dad, David is out of control. He's been up all night pacing around the house, making phone calls, yelling at people on the phone. He says you're bluffing, that the documents are fake." "And he, Jennifer? What do you think?" There was a long pause. I don't know what to believe anymore. David says Mom couldn't have kept so many secrets from him, that he's being manipulated by someone. "Your mother was smarter than any of us ever realized," I replied gently. "And she loved me enough to protect me even after her death." "Dad, David wants to set up a meeting. He says we can work this out as a family, without lawyers or courts." I smiled sadly. David was trying to maintain control of the situation, to avoid public exposure that could reveal her other frauds. "Tell David I'm willing to talk," I said. "But it will be on my terms." That afternoon, I began to fully explore the treasure Rebecca had left behind. The blue box contained much more than financial documents. There were letters, photographs, and meticulous records of the investigation she had conducted on David during his last years of life. Rebecca had documented everything: the discrepancies in David's professional history, her gambling debts that predated her marriage to Jennifer, even photographs of him entering suspicious establishments at times that contradicted her claims of being at work. But the most devastating discovery was a series of printed emails. Rebecca had created a fake account and corresponded with David, pretending to be a potential investor interested in his ventures. In their conversations, David had revealed compromising details about her intentions for my property, her plans to have me declared incompetent, and even contemptuous comments about her supposed senility. "The old man doesn't suspect a thing," David had written. Jennifer does whatever I ask. Once I get the power of attorney, I'm going to sell this house and invest everything in the Miami project. If it works, we'll be rich. If it doesn't, at least it won't be his money. Rebecca had been more astute than a professional detective. Each email was dated, authenticated, and legally admissible in court. As I studied the documents, the phone rang again. It was a lawyer he didn't know. "Mr. Patterson, my name is Bradley Morrison, representing David Carter. My client would like to schedule a meeting to resolve some family matters amicably." "Mr. Morrison," I replied calmly, "tell his client that I am available tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. But the meeting will be here at my house, and I will have my own legal representative present." There was a pause. "Mr. Patterson, I don't believe that's necessary for a family discussion. After his client vandalized my property this morning, everything became necessary." The call ended abruptly. I spent the rest of the day organizing all of Rebecca's documents in chronological order. Every piece of evidence, every letter, every financial transaction was cataloged and prepared for presentation. But more importantly, I began to understand the strategy that she had created for me. She hadn't just left me evidence to defend myself. She had left me the power to completely reconstruct the situation, to protect Jennifer from David's manipulations, and to ensure that men like him could not exploit vulnerable families in the future. The lawyer I hired was Harold Peterson, who specialized in family law and financial crimes. When I reviewed the documents with him, his eyes lit up with the appreciation of a professional recognizing exceptional work. "Matthew, her wife has built a case that would be difficult for an experienced investigator to put together," he said admiringly. "We have enough evidence not only to protect your assets, but to prosecute David for attempted fraud, coercion of the elderly, and possibly extortion." "Harold, I don't want to destroy David," I explained. "I want to protect my daughter and regain the dignity he tried to take from me." "Sometimes," Harold replied thoughtfully, "the best protection is full exposure of the truth." The day before the meeting, Jennifer showed up alone at my door. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked like she had aged years in just a few days. "Dad, I found things at home. Documents David hid, accounts I didn't know existed." She placed a folder on my dining room table. "I think he lied to me about a lot more than I realized." I examined the documents her had brought. Casino bills, unauthorized loan agreements, correspondence with collection agencies. David had used Jennifer's name as a guarantor in several fraudulent transactions. "Jennifer, did you authorize these guarantees?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I've never seen these documents before. He forged his signature on everything." I took a magnifying glass and compared the signatures to the one Jennifer had written on a birthday card for me the previous year. The differences were obvious, even to an untrained eye. "Daddy," she whispered, "I was an idiot, wasn't I?" "You were manipulated by someone very skilled at deceiving people," I gently corrected her. "That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you a victim who needs to be protected." That night, Jennifer stayed home, in the room that had been his during his teenage years. While she slept, I prepared my final strategy for the next day's meeting. David had made enough mistakes to face serious criminal consequences. But my goal wasn't just to punish him. It was to get my daughter back, protect other seniors from similar scams, and honor the memory of the woman who had sacrificed so much to prepare him for this moment. If you're following this journey of discovery and family justice, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow you'll find out how a simple family meeting would turn into the most decisive confrontation of his life. Rebecca had given him all the tools he needed. Now it was time to use them not only to defend himself, but to turn an attempt at exploitation into a lesson David would never forget. As I reviewed the documents one last time before going to sleep, I felt no anger or thirst for revenge. I felt something much more powerful, the quiet determination of a man who finally understood his true worth. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, but David arrived an hour early, bringing with him not only attorney Bradley Morrison, but also 2 people I hadn't expected, a bailiff and a county social worker. "Matthew," David announced with feigned courtesy, "we've decided to expedite the evaluation process. This is Sandra Mills from Elder Services." Her, a middle-aged woman, observed me with clinical eyes, taking notes on a clipboard. "Mr. Patterson, we have received reports that you may be being financially exploited by malicious third parties." The irony of the situation almost made me laugh. David was using his own protection system as a weapon against me. Interesting, I replied calmly. And who made these reports? Bradley Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Patterson, his son-in-law is concerned about her ability to make independent financial decisions, especially after the recent allegations about questionable documents. Jennifer remained silent in the corner of the room, her eyes red from crying. I could see the internal struggle in her expression, part of her still questioning whether she was doing the right thing. Well, I said, addressing Mrs. Mills, I would like to see these allegations documented. And I would also like his attorney to be present before any formal evaluation. David smiled smugly. Matthew, resistance to evaluations is often a symptom of cognitive decline. We're just trying to protect him. At that moment, Harold Peterson arrived, carrying 2 bulky folders. Behind him, to my surprise, was his judge Marcus Anderson, now in civilian clothes. Sorry for the delay, Harold said professionally. I brought an independent observer, as this situation involves serious allegations on both sides. David was visibly uncomfortable with the judge's presence. I don't believe this is necessary for a family matter. Actually, Marcus said calmly, when there are allegations of elder exploitation and mental capacity, it's important to have impartial observers. Mrs. Mills consulted his papers. Mr. Patterson, our records indicate concerns about financial documents that may not be authentic, as well as allegations that you are being influenced by third parties. What specific documents? Asked Harold, opening her first folder. Because I have here complete authentications of all of Mr. Patterson's assets, verified by 3 independent financial institutions. Bradley Morrison's face began to drain of color as Harold distributed copies of the documents. Notarized deeds, official bank statements, even the complete history of the investigations Rebecca had conducted on David. That's impossible, David muttered, leafing through the papers. Her didn't have access to that information. Rebecca Patterson had a degree in accounting and auditing, Harold explained calmly. She spent the last 5 years of her life meticulously documenting concerns about you, Mr. Carter. Ms. Mills examined the documents with growing interest. Mr. Carter, I see here records of multiple accounts in her wife's name that you appear to have used as collateral for unauthorized loans. David stood up abruptly. These are forgeries. Matthew is being manipulated by unscrupulous lawyers. That's when Harold opened the second folder, revealing something that made David turn completely pale, printouts of emails between David and Rebecca. Her late wife, Harold said, addressing me, created an online persona to investigate the activities of Mr. Carter. For 18 months, she corresponded with he, pretending to be a potential investor. I began reading the printouts aloud. The old man has no idea what's coming. Jennifer does whatever I ask. Once I get the power of attorney, I'm going to sell that house and invest everything in the Miami project. The silence in the room was absolute. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down his face. Mrs. Mills was frantically taking notes. This proves nothing, David said, but his voice had lost all conviction. Emails can be forged. Marcus leaned forward. Mr. Carter, do you recognize this language as his? Because we have complete metadata here, including IP addresses that match his residence. David looked desperately at his lawyer, who was hurriedly putting away his papers. Bradley, do something. I'm sorry, David, Bradley replied coldly. I cannot represent you in matters involving potential criminal fraud. Mrs. Mills closed her clipboard with a decisive snap. Mr. Patterson, based on what I see here, there is no evidence of cognitive decline or exploitation by third parties. In fact, it appears that he has been the victim of attempted fraud by his own family. David tried one last gambit. Jennifer, tell them. Tell them about how he's been acting strangely, forgetting things. Jennifer finally found her voice, but not in the way David had hoped. I lied about that, she whispered. David told me to make up those incidents. Dad never showed any signs of confusion or forgetfulness. The admission hit David like a sentence. He looked around the room, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation. You don't understand, he said, her voice becoming desperate. I have serious debts. People who will hurt me if I don't pay. His house was her only way out. And so you attempted to defraud an elderly man, Marcus said calmly. Mr. Carter, I suggest you seek independent legal advice. Quickly. Harold addressed Mrs. Mills. We believe there is sufficient basis to open a criminal investigation. We have evidence of document forgery, coercion of the elderly, and fraudulent use of financial information. David staggered to his feet. Matthew, you can't do this to me. I'm her husband. For the first time since the meeting began, I allowed all the anger I had been holding back to show in my voice. You tried to steal my home, my dignity, and my daughter. He used Jennifer as a puppet in his schemes. And now he wants my mercy. David looked at Jennifer one last time, but she had moved to the opposite side of the room. Jennifer, you can't abandon me now. You abandoned me the moment you decided to use me, she replied, her voice stronger than I had heard in years. You forged my signature on financial documents. You lied about your professional situation. You made me an accomplice to crimes I didn't even know I was committing. Ms. Mills closed her report. Mr. Patterson, I will be recommending that any investigation into his capacity be closed. I will also be referring this case to the Financial Crimes Department. As David was escorted out by the officers who had arrived during the meeting, he turned one last time. This isn't over, Matthew. You may have one today, but I have resources you can't even imagine. I smiled calmly. David, you forget. Your wife is my daughter. And through her, I've had access to all his resources for years. The final realization crossed his face like lightning. He finally understood that not only had he had lost to someone who knew his every move before he even made them. But there was one last revelation waiting for him, one that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Marcus approached me after David was taken away. Matthew, there's something you need to know about why I recognized you in court. Marcus approached me with a yellowed envelope in his hands. Matthew, 30 years ago, when I was a young clerk struggling to survive in the court system, a kind secretary stayed late to help me with a complex case that his supervisor had dumped on his desk. My heart raced as the memories crystallized. Rebecca, I whispered. Her brought me coffee, organized all the documents, and told me I had the potential to be something great if I just believed in myself, Marcus continued, his eyes shining with emotion. That night changed the course of my entire career. Jennifer looked between us, confused. Mom knew Judge Anderson? Your mother saved his career, Marcus explained. And today, after all these years, I was finally able to repay her by protecting the man she loved. Harold smiled discreetly. Matthew, that explains a few things about how this case was handled so quickly and efficiently. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of revelations. David was indicted on 14 separate charges: elder fraud, document forgery, coercion, emotional blackmail, and identity theft. The investigation revealed that he had attempted similar schemes with other elderly relatives in different states. Jennifer officially divorced him and moved back home. It wasn't an easy transition. Years of manipulation had left deep scars on our relationship. But slowly, through honest conversations and family therapy, we began to rebuild what David had destroyed. Dad, she said one Sunday morning, making pancakes in the same kitchen where she grew up, how did he find the strength to forgive all the terrible things she said? I placed my hand on her hand. Because her mother taught her that true love doesn't give up on the people we love, even when they temporarily lose their way. The legacy Rebecca had left behind was even more extensive than I had initially imagined. In addition to the properties and investments, she had established a network of financial connections that allowed me not only to protect our future, but to create something meaningful for others. We founded the Rebecca Patterson Foundation for the Protection of the Elderly, an organization that provides free legal assistance to older people facing family exploitation. We purchased a Victorian building in the city center and converted it into offices where volunteer lawyers work with private investigators to expose schemes similar to the one David had attempted. Margaret Henderson, my neighbor who had photographed David's vandalism, became our first administrative assistant. Matthew, she said during our inaugural meeting, Rebecca would be so proud of what you've built in her memory. The case against David went to trial 8 months later. The courtroom was packed, not just with family and friends, but with other victims of his previous schemes who had found the courage to testify after our story became public. David, visibly aged and thin, made one last attempt to manipulate the situation during his testimony. His Honor, I was just trying to take care of my family. Matthew was showing signs of decline, and his wife was worried. The prosecutor, a competent woman named Lisa Rodriguez, simply opened a folder and began reading the emails Rebecca had collected. David's voice, captured in his own words, betrayed his true intentions with crystal clarity. The old man has no idea what's coming. Jennifer does whatever I ask. Once I get the power of attorney, I'm going to sell this house and invest everything in the Miami project. If it works, we'll be rich. If it doesn't, at least it won't be his money. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Jennifer, sitting next to me, covered her face with her hands. David looked at her one last time, but found neither pity nor forgiveness in her gaze. Marcus pronounced the sentence with the gravity the moment demanded. "Mr. Carter, you have abused your family's trust in the most cowardly way possible. You manipulated her, his wife, into committing crimes against her father. His actions represent not only individual greed, but an attack on the foundations of family decency. I sentence him to 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and full restitution for all financial and emotional damages." 2 years later, as I watch Jennifer playing with her twin sons in the same backyard where she grew up, I reflect on the extraordinary journey Rebecca began with her quiet wisdom. The foundation has helped more than 200 families expose exploitation schemes. We have created an early warning system that identifies suspicious patterns in legal documents involving property transfers by seniors. We have established partnerships with local banks to flag unusual financial transactions involving retirees' accounts. David served his sentence and, as I understand it, moved to another state after his release. Jennifer never mentioned his name again, and I respect that choice. Some wounds heal better when they are not constantly picked at. Marcus Anderson became a close friend and regular advisor to the foundation. "Matthew," he told me recently, "Rebecca knew exactly what she was doing when she left you prepared for this battle. She turned you into the guardian our community needed." The deepest truth I learned through this experience was not about revenge or justice, but about purpose. Rebecca didn't leave me wealth just to protect our personal assets. She equipped me to protect the dignity of all who face similar vulnerability. Every morning, he still wakes up at 6 o'clock, makes coffee in the same cracked blue mug, and checks on the African violets in the kitchen window. But now these rituals carry a different meaning. They are not reminders of loneliness, but celebrations of continuity, of love that transcends death, of legacies that grow through purposeful action. If this story of transformation and family justice has touched his heart, subscribe to the channel because there is still much to learn about how true love can manifest in ways we never imagined possible. Jennifer often asks how I was able to forgive her so completely for participating in David's schemes. The answer is simple: when you understand that the people you love may be temporarily lost, but never permanently destroyed, forgiveness becomes not only possible, but inevitable. David tried to turn me into a victim, but Rebecca turned him into a protector. And that difference made all the difference in the world.